I do think that one of the things we need to keep thinking and working and legislating around is how do we make Xi Jinping's morning ritual, not today, not this week, not this month, and having a common approach to pre-signaling about the price that will be imposed on China, China's leadership, China's economy in exchange for their activities against Taiwan helps deter. Senator Risch in particular, but a number of other colleagues felt that if we had been more active and clear and aggressive in signaling to Putin the price he would pay for invading Ukraine, we might have deterred Putin's invasion of Ukraine or full spectrum, large-scale invasion since he initially invaded in 2014. What's your assessment of what scale and coordination of signaling around price would actually be most effective?
It's a great question. I actually think that some of the research that Bonnie Lin has done at CSIS on gray zone responses is super helpful here. The longer that you delay a response to gray zone aggression, you have to have a more outsized response to reestablish sort of a deterrent baseline. I think, as I sort of think about the PRC, I agree with Dr. Ratner. We're talking about a particularly risk-averse regime that is usually inward focused, and I think very cognizant in their own discourse about their own limitations and weaknesses. I think us very cleanly mapping all of their dependencies and all of their vulnerabilities and starting to signal where we have leverage, whether it's in the tech space. I certainly think the economic space is one that's not been sort of addressed cohesively. Again, it just forces the Chinese to start to account for all of these potential complications that will make something that is already probably the most consequential and difficult invasion known to mankind even less likely. But then you can't discount what we're seeing in the gray zone space and the silent subjugation and I think sort of the ramping up of activity there, such that we want to buy time and slow them down. I think it's probably what we need to internalize as our strategy. Anything that does and accomplish that objective, I think should be get a fair shake.
Mr. Powell, last month, the PRC announced a new national nature preserve at the Scarborough Shoal that would create a protected area around a whole coral reef ecosystem. Philippine officials have called this another PRC land grab. Could you just briefly walk through the impact of this designation and how it relates to a broader pattern of lawfare tactics designed, again, below the threshold of military aggression to expand PRC control in the South China Sea?
Yes, Senator Coons, this is a great question. And I think, as most of us know, the PRC campaign for Scarborough Shoal really began in 2012 when it basically took effective control of access to Scarborough Shoal. And then last year, actually, early in the year, what we saw was kind of a remarkable sequence of events. There was an expansion of Chinese paramilitary activity, and I classify China Coast Guard and Maritime Militia as a paramilitary force, in part because I think it's very important for us to realize that we don't have a paramilitary force, which is part of why we don't have a good response to these assets. So they began to deny Philippine access in a much more aggressive way early last year. They also sent in a scientific expedition to take a look at the condition of the shoal. And two things happened. One is that they immediately banned their giant clam harvesting fleet, which all disappeared around June of last year, indicating that they probably found out that giant clam harvesting, which is extraordinarily destructive, had done great damage to the shoal. And second, they issued a report that said the condition of the shoal is great. So we then saw they also established straight baselines around the shoal, essentially marking it out as territory. And so this establishment of a nature preserve is sort of an environmental overlay onto that, essentially land grab at this point. So we can see all of these things working together: the establishment of effective control, the lawfare, the administrative control, all of these things, and the denial of Philippine access. And in fact, Senator, I will also say that the collision that we observed in August was in part a result of this establishment of effective control, because the Philippine ship that got in close to the shoal, I think got in a lot closer than China expected, which was what drew in the destroyer, which almost caused that mutual defense treaty triggering event that we all fear. So it's part of a larger campaign. And one last thing, just on top of what Mr. Singleton has said about Taiwan and what we've all been talking about, I'm one, because I've been looking at this in the South China Sea so long, I don't actually expect to see a large-scale quarantine or blockade or anything like that. I'd be more afraid of what would start happening if all of a sudden China announced that it was going to enact a new safety regime for LNG ships inbound to Taiwan and begin to say turn around one and then maybe another one. And again, that would be much more in line with the ICAD kind of campaign that they've been waging.
I agree with you that, look, we need to plan for and prepare for the possibility of a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, but doctrine, history, preparedness, risk aversion strongly suggests that they're much more likely to engage in the kind of creeping, steady, aggressive behavior that you were just describing, and that allows them to assert sovereignty over a greater and greater area of the region. A last question, if I might. Dr. Ratner, you've talked about how past U.S. policy has been overly reactive to PRC actions. What would a more proactive U.S. government approach ideally look like, given where we are today and looking forward, given your experience?
Well, I guess I would, as I mentioned in my written testimony, I think there are a couple ways to think about this. One is at the tactical and operational level, and then another is at the strategic level. I think at the tactical level, as we've talked about, there are things we can be doing operationally to be doing our own salami slicing back. There are new emerging defense technologies, autonomy, low-cost, attritable systems that we can be using ourselves and providing to our partners for them to get out on the water and start asserting their claims instead of just defending against PRC incursions. There are things we can be doing on the development and assistance front to try to get ahead of the very likely forms of political influence operations, cyber intrusions that we know the PRC is conducting. Again, we talked about the information domain, so there are ways to get after this. But I guess what I would say, one thing I think we have to remember as we think about this issue set is when we see the PRC doing something out at Second Thomas Shoal or out at Scarborough Shoal, those very specific tactical features and locations are important, but they're part of a bigger story, which is China's ambitions to control the South China Sea, to control the East Asian littoral. What we need to be doing in response and in parallel to China's ICAD activities is not just playing whack-a-mole, though we should be out there defending their tactical moves, but rather thinking about what are the strategic actions we need to be taking to ensure that they can't, in the end, have that kind of effective control that they want. So with the Philippines, for instance, yes, we need to be supporting them out at Scarborough Shoal, but we ought to be working on our force posture in the Philippines. We ought to be expanding the number of locations we're investing in. We ought to be investing a lot more in those locations to develop them. We should be bringing more advanced capabilities into those locations. We should be operating more and more with our allies and partners, the Australians and the Japanese, who both have reciprocal access agreements now with the Philippines. They can be operating and supporting these EDCA sites as well. They can be contributing development assistance that are connecting roads to our military sites. So when we pick up our heads a few years from now, yeah, maybe China has more Coast Guard vessels around Second Thomas Shoal or Scarborough Reef, but hey, look, the United States has a collective defense pact with our partners. It's got a robust rotational military presence in the Philippines. It's got advanced counter ship capabilities now in the Philippines, and we're operating with our allies and partners like never before. I think that's a strategic victory for the United States. That's what we ought to be aiming for.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. And thank you, Senator Ricketts, for our trip. We literally got to see Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, that whole West Philippine Sea region on our trip together earlier this year was enormously illuminating. And thank you for this hearing.